Okay, we're going to get started. Again, thank you so much for joining us today. I know a lot of people who watched last week mentioned they were going to be out playing golf and doing things, and they come back and catch the video a little bit later, which is perfect. Again, my name is Vance Farino. I am an exercise physiologist. We're here obviously for the Cliffs, and golf performance specialist, so background in biomechanics, how the body moves. What we're going to we're going to talk about today is in our part 2 of our 5-part series is the pelvis. Now, last week we started with the feet. We talked about how important the feet were and how they work the ground and ground reaction forces. We used Sam Snead was quoted as saying that the feet are the most active part of a golf swing. And most of us don't think of it that way. Think, well, everything else is moving, my feet are anchored. But there was so much going on there. If you haven't had a chance to see the video, I encourage you to take a look. We did a follow-up video just earlier this week, looking at the soft tissue of the feet and how to gently kind of work that soft tissue, how to get those feet to function a bit better. And they actually added what we call an intrinsic foot exercise. So it was a nice follow-up to our golf video on that. I also, before we get too deep into that, want to thank Vanessa and Patrick for their help in getting this all put together. So besides the foot video that we talked about, we went through last week, there was also a prep video. And again, I'm hoping that everybody had a chance to take a look at that. Some of the verbiage and the nomenclature that I'll use was prepped up in that video. I will try to go over some of that in detail, but not maybe as deep a detail. Just make sure everybody's on the same page with it. But what's really important, the names, the nomenclature, none of that matters. It's the concept, just understanding what this big area is doing in the 3 planes and motions that we talked about, and how to make it bigger, how to make it stronger, how to give it better range of motion will not only help your golf game, but it's going to help your rest of other life activities. Okay, so with that said, hips and pelvis. So when we're talking about the power zone of the body, this is kind of where the rubber meets the road. All the ground reaction forces we talked through those feet, as I come in here, the role and the goal of it is to turn this system on. We did mention in the feet, when the foot hits the ground, it creates a chain reaction up into this region, and it gets all those big hip muscles, those big butt muscles, those deep rotator muscles to all engage. And that's where our power is. I like to joke that God gave us big butts for a reason. These butts are meant to absorb all this gravity, ground reaction, and so forth. And like I mentioned earlier, if you're lacking mobility and strength in the glutes and so forth, it's going to affect every aspect of your life. To pick on the guys here, can't tell you how many guys, if they don't have a belt on, their pants are not staying up. They have no butt, and that's a problem. So there are exercises you can do. The densest muscle in your body is back here, and you really need to work on that. If you watch professional sports of any level, and obviously this is golf, if you're watching a PGA event, and I'll kind of put this out to the ladies, what is the one common denominator you notice with all these guys when you're watching the golf tournament? They all got great butts. You'll never see a high-level athlete, sprinters, and it doesn't matter what sport, and they with a flat butt with this saggy nothing there. So those big, powerful muscles are critical to anything that we're going to do that's athletic, but anything. If I want to lift better, if I want to push and be able to pull, be able to anything in life, I want to dance with my wife better. Having a mobility and strength in these hips really, really matter. So what we covered today is going to be specific to golf, but take the idea and just say, this is going to help you no matter what you want to do. Okay. Going back into, as we look at this hips and pelvis, what I first want to talk a little bit is the protective mechanism that they play for other parts of the body. So as we start talking in a few minutes about these motions, I want to talk about what happens when you don't have those motions or you don't sequence them well. The lumbar spine, which sits on top of this pelvis, is not designed to rotate. So now I have a sport that's telling me to create all this rotation. Most of that rotation is happening down at the pelvis. Now, there's some of that, the thoracic spine, we'll talk about that next week. So if my pelvis doesn't have the ability to work in this transverse plane, and I'm trying to bring a club around my body over and over, the lumbar spine, which sits above it, is looking down saying, hey, hips, what are you doing? You're not doing your job, and we're getting our butt kicked. So when the golfers come in to see me with back pain, I don't even really go to the back. The first thing you got to look at is what is the mobility of the hips and what is their strength in those hips. And the same with the knee. The knee, we say, is caught between the foot and the hips with no place to run, no place to hide. So when we have somebody coming in, there's knee pain, and if they're a golfer, again, we're going to try to assess them out and figure out what's happening here that might be bothering their knee. And a great example of this, back in about 2010, Tiger Woods, I think this is before everything fell apart for him. It was before all that. Because he was having some left knee issues. He was having a lot of pain, you could see, in his golf swing. And it was really, from the background and training I've received, it was easy to see that his left hip wasn't doing this. He didn't have the ability to go in through the motion that was necessary to decelerate the force of his swing. All those rotary forces got to go somewhere. So if you think about like a horse's rein, as you start pulling back on it and it slows everything down, same thing. As I'm coming in through these motions, all this structure that we're going to go through has to be able to slow, it's decelerating, and I get to my position. If I get here, and I hit a roadblock because I don't have that motion, that rotational force is driving right to my knee. And it was obvious in his swing, he couldn't do that very well. And during one of our functions where he was present because of the High Carolina property, I had a chance to talk to him, and I was there with my mentor who's trained me on this. And we were saying, that left hip is glitch, you're not getting through it, and that's what's bothering your knee. And he was kind of a little bit dismissive of it, saying it was from old skateboarding shoes as a kid, but it's pretty obvious it wasn't. So in a talk like this in front of a group, just said, hey, if I said to the group that was there, I said, if he doesn't clean that left hip up, he's going to hurt that knee again. It was 2 weeks later, he was back off, he was out of the tournaments again because he tore his knee up. So again, what we're going to cover here, we'll cover every aspect of helping you live a better functional life, not just golf. All right, get that out of the way. So in our foot talk, we talked about that transference from the ground up here. Now again, so our goal is to get these hips to do all this function. So what I want to talk is, what do the hips actually do? So one of the first things we're going to do, I'm just going to put my club to the side here, is the hips in 3 planes of motion. In that prep video, we talked about the sagittal plane, we talked about the frontal plane, and the transverse, or the rotational plane. All 3 planes are critical. Transverse plane, probably the most of the 3. But starting with the sagittal plane, I'm going to turn to the camera here. My hip can flex. Now again, I'm doing what is called a hip hinge. Hip hinging means I am purely flexing at my hip. And I make that point because sometimes I see people doing stuff and they're flexing through their spine. Now there's times to flex through their spine, and there's times not to. But for pure hip flexion, and if you're watching, stand up and feel this out. Get to a good position, get like you're over a golf ball. This over a golf ball is my setup, should be a hip hinge. Now sometimes we'll see people and they're here because they don't have the ability from mobility, from hamstring tension, to get into a good setup. So the ability just to hip hinge is really critical. This is called hip flexion. Now, the hip flexion, I can, in that sagittal plane, I can go into hip extension. And it might be easier to see this if I come here. As I drive through this position, actually, let me set the camera from here. As I come in here, this is extension. This hip is now extending. So I should have the ability to extend my hip and then flex my hip. Okay, and that is what we call the sagittal plane of motion. In the frontal plane of motion, my hip needs to have the ability to both add, this is called abduction, abduction, and then adduction, adduction. Now again, it has to have ability to get back and forth through this plane. Again, we see it blocks, especially as people are turning in, so we're going to assess how well that's going to move. And then the last of the 3 is the transverse. And again, so what we're talking on this, and this is, again, I think the most critical, is as I go to make any kind of a turning motion, notice that my shoulders and my pelvis are both turning together, but technically at different speeds. If I put my hand over my belt buckle and I put my hand here, as I turn, notice they're both going to go to the right, but this is going to the right a little faster. And what that does, it closes this hip down. That is called internal rotation. And that is one of the biggest keys to a powerful golf swing, is the ability to internally rotate that hip. When I cannot internally rotate that hip, if I'm coming and I block that and this ends here, my club is here. And I'm trying to figure out how to get it. My body will cheat. Most of the time, we'll see that plane either get super steep, tends to be maybe more, or sometimes you'll see somebody flatten out and try to get everything to turn around. So that internal rotation is critical. The other opposite side of that is called external rotation. So now I have both of these, and as this turns away, it goes a little bit faster, and now this hip is turning out. It's called external rotation. Now, when we go back and we look at the 6 different patterns, the 6 different motions we covered in 3 planes of motion, we're trying to get the hip to go through these patterns. So sometimes you have a pure plane, and that's possible. But in most athletic motions, like in this golf swing, you usually have all 3 planes working together. So let's go through that quick and tie this back to golf. So as I'm in my position here, and again, I'll probably start here. So here's my setup. That's my hip hinge. I'm in that flex position. Now from that position, as I start taking my club away, notice how I am here. As my weight starts coming over to my right foot, we're talking this side first, I am creating that adduction I talked about. Remember we talked adduction here. So now this hip is flexed to start. It's now starting to adduct. And because we talked about the arms pulling the pelvis, it's now internally rotating. So when I combine flexion, adduction, and internal rotation, I've got those 3 loaded, and that is the sweet spot of power. So our goal is to make sure that somebody has all the range of motion that they need to create all 3 of those planes of motion and to load that. The other side of that coin is oftentimes the ability to control that motion. We're going to talk into motor control in a second. Now going back onto the golf swing on the backside, on the backswing on this side. Now on this side, as I go against, notice I'm here, the flexion we saw already, but as I come to here, this side is going through that abduction. And because this is turning away, it's externally rotating. So we said that the 3 sweet spots for true loading as far as power was internal rotation, flexion, and adduction. Here we have the flexion, but we're externally rotating and abducting, which is not the strongest position for the hip joint, but that is part of how this is supposed to set up. So again, if I have somebody and they're tight through here and they try to go turn and they do not have the ability to abduct that hip, again, big problem. Okay, now let's go follow through. Now, Harvey Pinnock, we can look at different points through the swing, but Harvey Pinnock had a thought process, and I think it was perfect. Because if you can get both ends of the bookend, working and fixed, it goes everything in between will come together. And I agree with that. That was the wind shutting our door. All right, now let's look at the follow through. So and I'm going to start on this. So on this, because this is the big break, and I was mentioning with Tiger, this is the huge break. This takes a lot of internal rotation to get my trunk position here, but this takes even more to slow all that down. So I've got all this momentum, my weight is transferring, I'm driving through, and I've got to be able to hit the brake and get through that. So as I'm coming down through that swing, so this hip that we'll start with the, let me start, yeah, so we're going to start where this is externally rotated, it begins to internally rotate. Now from this internal rotation, we talked about is flexing, it's going to start extending, and then we talked about it being abducted, and it starts adducting. But the big key on this is the adduction and the internal rotation are going to be the big kind of brakes, those horse's rein that are going to slow this down, and the extension will help to a small degree. So if I don't have the ability to get this pelvis to turn against this femur, I have big problems. And again, whether it's my knee, oftentimes you're going to see people walking out of their golf swing. I will touch on the thoracic spine reason for that next week, because there's a great example. Sometimes people, they come and they just can't decelerate it, and they'll walk through the swing. So now that we know what the motion should be, how we go about assessing that, and there's a lot of different ways. When somebody comes in to see me, I will always start with a little bit of a global patterning. And then from the global patterning, then I'll tweak the golf assessment. And what I mean by that is this. If I want to see how well they create flexion, I just have them step and create a flexion pattern. And there's a couple of ways of doing that. Generally, I'll use that posterior step and the arms will reach. I want to see how well they extend. I will get them to run through the position of extension. If I see something doesn't look right to me, now again, there's something where I need to discern. Is it a lack of motion or is it a lack of motor control? They just can't create the movement. So what we'll do, and especially when I have my true stretch available, non-COVID times, is, all right, I watched somebody give me an example from here. So what I should see is that type of a position. Extension coming from the hip, right up through the spine and through everything. Now, a lot of times I'll see these kind of a weird position. So the first of all, they're not extending very good. All right, so why? Again, so are they just lacking the motion? So if I slow them down, and that's how, again, this is where the assessment piece sometimes will go off in different directions. I can slow them down, put them in position, especially in the true stretch, and it's like, wow, they have a lot of hip extension. They have no idea how to use it. And that can play through any of the positions as I take them through a rotational drill. We have a few different ways we'll assess the rotations and ways that we assess the frontal plane. And oftentimes, somebody will just be horrible at those motions. And when we slow them down and position them, they have it, they have no idea how to use it. And that's just as bad as not having it. So I can have somebody who I do, and there's just no motion there. They are tight as a drum. And we have to fix that. We mobilize that tissue. We will stretch that tissue. We're going to strengthen all those things. But if somebody is Gumby-ish and they can do all that in a fixed position, but they can't control it, they have no motor control on how to use it, that's really an equal problem. So they're not going to spend a lot of time being mobilized. We're not going to soft tissue them a lot and put them in a lot of stretch positions. We're going to be moving them more into the motor control patterns that teach their body how to sequence all this. So one of the things I want to tie into this, and at this point, is core. So everybody heard core training, core this, core that, and it became a big buzzword, especially through the 90s. And then core automatically became synonymous with functional training. And functional training is market like anything. Concepts come up, people market tools, and all of a sudden that tool becomes functional. And that's just not the case. So we have what we call our litmus test. And for an example, so when we talk about core strength, authentic, upright core strength, upright is the key thing. If I am going to strengthen this core, I've got to do so. And again, right now we're talking hips and pelvis, but the core is the hips and the pelvis as well as the abdominals and that low back, this whole region. So we know that in order in that rotational plane is that when my shoulders and pelvis move together, that's a golf swing. This is a throw. Anything that's going to create power to a push, to a pull, is being generated. Of course, we talk from the ground up, but the shoulders and pelvis are moving in the same direction at different speeds. So imagine if I had like a rubber cylinder and I took that cylinder and I twisted they're going and I'm twisting the top faster than the bottom and I let go. The rubber cylinder would unload, and that's what's happening within our body. So with core training, if you're going to try to train your core to be better, you need to be on your feet. Now, there's some ground-based things that are perfectly fine. But if all you're doing is on the ground and there's crunches or there's a bunch of staticky stuff doing it, you're not training your core properly, or at least not to be better at golfing and upright function. A simple paradigm to remember this when it comes to your core: if your butt ain't moving, your core ain't grooving. So if you're thinking about you're doing something, and if it's on the floor base and you're doing it, you might say, okay, that's fine, I understand it, but now I understand it's not going to be the most functional. The other thing, again, going back to some of the gimmicky, if I can, is I'm going to grab the Swiss ball. There's a lot of tools like Swiss balls, and so from here, and balance this and so forth. Again, you got to think these things. So people are on a balance this ball and working my core. How often are you on ground that's shaking, unless you're in California on the San Andreas Fault? Same thing with this. People will sit on a Swiss ball, and again, they're doing all these things. Again, if it's somewhere within the contents of your program, but you get back to your feet, that's fine. But when the gist of it is this, and kind of a funny story tying this in, is again, one of the leading authorities on this I was privileged to train under, we had a workshop guy who wrote a whole workbook on using the physio ball and all these things for function. And then he asked this guy, he says, well, what do you think about the physio ball for function? He goes, hey, he goes, if you've got a red ball growing out your butt, he goes, it's perfect for function. If you don't, maybe not so much. Which kind of shot the guy's book down. Anyway. All right, so let's go back into our assessment. I just want to make that thing, because people think they're training their core to be stronger, and then they get to their feet and it's just not doing it. In the earlier segment last week and in the prep, we talked about proprioception. Proprioception is everything. When we talk about hip stretching, we're going to go into some of the hip stretching stuff in this, as well. But if I am stretching my hips, laying on my back, and I'm pulling this over, that's a nice fascial stretch, nothing wrong with it. But if I get to my feet and I do not integrate that into a movement pattern that my nervous system, that the proprioceptive system understands, dealing with gravity, ground reaction, and momentum, none of that matters. I could be Gumby on the floor, but as soon as I stand to my feet, if my nervous system's not going to allow that motion to take place, it's not going to take place. So again, understanding integration of anything that's going to be ground-based up back onto your feet. So all those stretches on your back that you're doing to help stretch out your hips, fine, but you got to get back up onto your feet and turn those back into movement patterns that utilize the 6 motions that we discussed, the 6 planes of motion, the 6 positions and motions that we just discussed in the 3 planes of motion. All right, back to the golf swing. So in the golf swing, so now I have somebody and I've taken them through and I'm watching the patterning and they're progressing on. All right, so now somebody, not too bad. Those patterns all look pretty decent. I can slow them down, take a look. Now, if I want to see a little bit deeper where they're going to go, there's something within movement we call a buffer zone. And a buffer zone just means this. If I have, well, let's call it the golf swing. If my body needs X amount of motion to create a golf swing successfully, I'll do it this way. So I have this little circle. That's the motion that my body needs in 3 planes of motion to give me a good golf swing. My goal is to train beyond that. I want to have buffer zones. I don't want to just be tight in that circle. So what we can do is in our assessment tool is also look at that. So if I have somebody, I can take them to the top of their backswing and do a certain amount of moving within it. What I personally like to do is pre-position the hips into different positions. So if I was going to look at this, well, actually, let's take a look at the back, this leg, our trail leg, that power side. I could push their position where I'm going to position the foot. The camera's not quite getting to my feet. Or my foot is in front of me and turning this way. Now I am taking up all of that motion in that hip. I'm pretty much taking it almost to my end range. I take the club back to the top of my backswing. And the question is there motion? If I'm here and I try to get somebody to move and they can't, I know that there's no buffer zones there. And our goal is to make sure if I can get to a point where I can take my club and I can drive and open all these zones up, as soon as I come back within here, there's no problem with creating that swing. So when we assess, again, there's not one assessment that's exactly for every person. As we start working through it, if I see that your transverse plane rotation of the hips are not good, your assessment may tweak out a little bit different than somebody who doesn't move well in the frontal plane. And there's going to be some commonalities, but that's how the assessment piece winds up going. Now, from the assessment piece, we have to say, well, how do we strength train? How do we mobilize all that we're doing? Now, again, so Patrick and I will do a follow-up video, and we actually have one on some of the golf fit classes that talk about how to mobilize the pelvis, and there's a few strengthening things. But briefly, as I had mentioned last week, every test that we do is, in essence, an exercise. So I don't want to do a test thing that has no relationship to movement and then give you a movement pattern. So if I'm testing you through here and you have an issue with that, I want to give you that as homework and any of these patterns. And then we start slowly building onto that. We talk about, for hips and pelvis, as we're talking, this is our zone today, squatting. Squatting is critical, it's wonderful. A lot of people still have this idea that squatting is bad for your knees. Totally not true. And that was based on a 1960 research project, which has been refuted about 1,000 times since. Lunging, we do lunges. Oh, lunges are not that my knees don't like lunging. It's because you're not doing them right. Everybody, every lunge doesn't have to be a sagittal plane to the ground. So we're going to watch your body go through these various patterns, and we figure out how to load you pain-free if you're having issues, to broaden that sphere, to open up that buffer zone. And then we start building those pieces in. And again, no two are going to be exactly alike. A lot of commonalities, but no two exactly alike. And then the other tying a little bit, tying the foot back into it is going to be back into the balance piece. And again, balance is part of strength. So once I have somebody and I know that we're getting the mobility, we're getting some strength, general strength, then we can come into some balance strength, and then get into the golf specific strength, where I can drive my rotational patterns, where I'm going to come in and I have maybe a light dumbbell. And these are very specific, where I can kind of hit the golf patterns, exaggerate it with rotational reaches and so forth. Other parts of sequencing in our exercise programs, we do a lot with medicine balls. If I have a medicine ball and I start coming through, notice if I have a medicine ball and I'm coming through, as I'm here, doesn't that look a bit like my golf swing? My pelvis is going to unwind and we bring the ball through. So for people who really have a hard time understanding how to use the ground reaction we talked about earlier, and using that butt and those hips in 3 planes, the medicine ball helps load that. So we can create a number of patterns that we use that integrate the shoulder rotation, pelvis rotation, a little bit faster. As we talk, we get that rotational core strength. And all these patterns tie together so that over time, there's nowhere within the boundaries of your golf swing or anything you want to do, you should have some level of fluidity. And the last piece I kind of want to say on this is injuries. Everybody comes in, for the most part, everybody who comes in is dealing with an injury, has had injuries. That's not a problem, because again, I have 6 different motions that the hip has to do in the 3 planes. If you are having pain in a particular motion, we move around it and we build around that, and slowly we weave. So a motion that might have been giving you pain, this gives me back pain. We don't do it. We play with it. We tweak it. And all of a sudden, 6, 8 weeks later, that person can get back to that position and not have pain. So that takes care of what the motion, what these do, the importance of why this is so important, how we look at it in the golf swing, and then how do we build in the exercise programs, and how do we work through ground painful areas. Question and answer time. So if you want to throw a couple of questions up, and I'll do my best I can to answer them. I'm going to sneak in here to me. If there's questions. I know I was so thorough that I left all questions answered. No, I know it's not the case. Anyway, we'll give it a couple seconds here for them to pop up. And if not, the videos, Patrick will have all these videos up to review again. Please do not hesitate to reach out to me. Again, Vance Farino, for those of you who don't know me, I'm at Mountain Park Wellness. And you can find my contact information on the website. And I'd be glad to discuss a little bit more what your situation is, what you're dealing with, if it's a difficulty of pain, if it's just performance. Again, performance is fun. We're not having to dance around injuries, and we can kind of go right at the performance issues that are at hand. So, so I have a question here. I've heard the hips don't lie. Is that true? Well, the person asking the question is a bit suspect, but we'll leave it at that. But no, they don't lie when it comes to motion. Actually, that's a good question. I'm going to squeal on Patrick some, but the hips don't lie. One of the easiest ways of assessing somebody is watch them walk. A lot of times when somebody's coming in, I just try to watch them walk across the parking lot, or just watch them, and sometimes, much to my wife's annoyance, if I'm on Main Street and I'm watching somebody, and you could pick up in the gait that somebody is not walking well. When we walk, and again, I'm going to go off a tangent here. I'll chase a rabbit, so to speak. Thank you, Patrick. Is that as I'm walking, there's a certain level. There's all this triplane motion as my foot lands, as my hips load, as I go through all this, and I'm exaggerating how much that occurs. So we look for a certain level of fluidity between your flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, internal rotation. If we see somebody walking and you can just see there's something off there, that step's not right, we can pretty much pinpoint if it's coming from the hips. So no, the hips do not lie. I'm sure that's not how you get the question, Patrick, but that's my answer. All right, we have no more questions that have popped up. I want to thank you so much for coming out, for taking the time in your morning. If you've enjoyed these, please let some other people know. Hopefully we can build our audience up a little bit. If you have feedback, please reach out to me. If you're like, hey, Vance, this is too fast or too much, just talk to me. I would love to be able to tailor these a little bit better. It's vfarino@cliffsliving.com. Any feedback that you have will be wonderful. And I thank you so much for your time.